This street should be full of life. Kids walking to school, cars pulling out for the morning commute, curtains opening, kettles boiling, doors slamming. Behind this door, nothing has moved in years. No post collected, no lights switched on, just dust settling on a life that used to happen here. And this isn't one house. Across this single local authority area, there are more than 2,000 homes standing exactly like this one, empty, often for years, sometimes for decades. Meanwhile, just a few streets away, families are sleeping in temporary accommodation. Young people are being told there's simply nothing available. Waiting lists stretch into the thousands. So tonight, we're asking the question that residents, campaigners, and even some council officials have been asking for years. Is this Britain's hidden housing scandal? And why isn't more being done to fix it? Let's start with what we actually know. According to the most recent council tax base figures, England now has over 540,000 empty homes, and of those, more than 300,000 have been empty for 6 months or longer, the threshold the government uses to define a property as long-term empty. That figure has been rising for 4 years in a row. In fact, when you add in second homes and properties exempted from council tax for other reasons, the total number of homes in England not being used as anyone's primary residence has now crossed 1 million. 1 million homes. In a country where over 1 million households are sitting on council housing waiting lists, and where more than 350,000 people, including tens of thousands of children, are living in temporary accommodation tonight. Visual, side-by-side graphic. 1 million plus homes not lived in versus 1 million plus households on waiting lists. Now, zoom in on area. Here, council records show over 2,000 properties sit empty, many of them long-term, some for more than a decade. To put that in context, that's roughly the size of a small town's entire housing stock sitting dark. This isn't a secret. Local journalists have written about it. Campaign groups have flagged it in freedom of information requests. Councillors have stood up in chamber meetings and called it, in their own words, a scandal and a wasted resource. So why does it persist? To understand that, we need to walk the streets ourselves. I want to show you what 2,000 empty homes actually looks like, not as a spreadsheet figure, but as a place. This house has been empty for, by the council's own estimate, close to 8 years. The garden's completely overgrown. The gutterings come away from the roof. If you look closely, you can see where rainwater's been running down the brickwork for so long it's actually started to crack the render. Every week this sits empty, it deteriorates a little more. And every week it deteriorates, it becomes a little more expensive and a little less likely that anyone will ever bring it back into use. Not every empty home looks like a derelict wreck. Some of these properties are perfectly habitable, recently renovated even. They're empty for entirely different reasons. A death in the family with no will, an inheritance dispute that's dragged through probate for years, an owner who lives overseas and simply hasn't dealt with it. According to Action on Empty Homes, the single largest category of long-term empty properties nationally, over 124,000 homes, falls under exactly this: properties tied up because the owner has died and the estate hasn't been settled. That's nearly 60% of all council tax-exempt empty homes in the country. And that's part of what makes this story so frustrating. It's not always a villain twirling a moustache, sitting on a portfolio of empty houses out of pure greed, though, as we'll see, that does happen too. Often it's something far more mundane: bureaucracy, paperwork, a legal limbo that nobody's in a hurry to resolve. But the effect on a street is the same either way. One empty house brings down the value of the houses around it. It attracts antisocial behaviour: broken windows, fly tipping, sometimes squatting. It becomes the house kids dare each other to look into. and multiply that by 2,000 spread across an area, and you start to understand why residents are angry. We hear residents describe it simply. They've watched a neighbour's house sit empty for years, watched it slowly fall apart, and watched their own property's value and their street's reputation slide along with it, while, just a short walk away, people are stuck on housing waiting lists for properties that look almost identical to the one rotting on their street. Here's where it gets complicated, and where most of the public anger is aimed, often unfairly, at the wrong target. Councils actually do have powers to deal with persistently empty homes. The best known is the Empty Dwelling Management Order, or EDMO, a legal mechanism that lets a council effectively take over the management of a property that's been empty for at least 6 months, lease it out, and use the income to cover renovation costs. Sounds like the perfect solution, right? In practice, EDMOs are barely used. National research has found that of councils that responded to Freedom of Information requests, fewer than 1 in 10 had used the power even once in 5 years. The process is slow, legally complex, and resource-intensive, and most councils, especially after years of budget cuts, simply don't have an empty homes team big enough to chase 2,000 cases. The other major tool is the Empty Homes Premium, an additional council tax charge which the government has allowed local authorities to raise up to 100% extra for homes empty more than 2 years, and even higher penalties for properties empty far longer than that. It sounds like a strong deterrent. But here's the catch. For the kind of owner who can afford to let a 6- or 7-figure property sit empty in central London, sometimes owned through an offshore company, sometimes by someone who simply never visits, doubling the council tax bill is barely a rounding error. As one housing charity put it, for a very wealthy buyer spending millions, even a 100% council tax premium isn't much of a disincentive. And that brings us to a phrase you'll hear a lot in this conversation. Buy to leave. These are properties, often new-build flats, sometimes period houses in desirable areas, purchased purely as a store of value. The owner has no intention of living in it or renting it out. It simply sits there, appreciating, while the local housing market around it tightens. In London alone, investigations have found tens of thousands of empty homes, including properties whose owners were revealed, after a data leak from one council, to include offshore companies linked to oligarchs, foreign royalty, and multi-millionaire investors. Area may not have the same scale of international investment property as central London, but the underlying dynamic, properties treated as assets rather than homes, exists almost everywhere. Empty homes cluster, just in different forms. From inherited houses nobody's dealt with, to small landlords who've simply walked away from a property that needs more repair work than it's worth, to speculative purchases waiting for prices to rise. Now let's put the two halves of this story side by side. On one side, 2,000 empty properties, many genuinely habitable or repairable with investment that's a fraction of the cost of building new. On the other side, families on the council's housing register, some waiting years for a suitable property. People in temporary accommodation, which, despite the name, can mean months or even years in a single hotel room, with children sharing beds, no kitchen, no space to do homework. Nationally, the number of homeless households in temporary accommodation in England has been described by MPs as a crisis in its own right. And the cost to councils of housing people this way, often in commercial hotels at vastly inflated nightly rates, runs into hundreds of millions of pounds a year. Money that, in many cases, could instead be spent renovating empty homes and turning them into permanent secure tenancies. It's worth pausing on that point because it's at the heart of why people call this a scandal, rather than just an unfortunate statistic. This isn't simply there aren't enough houses. In area, and in many parts of the country, there are enough houses, or close to it. The problem is that thousands of them are locked away by legal limbo, by neglect, by economics that make it more profitable, or simply easier to leave a property empty than to deal with it. It's not as if nothing has ever been tried. Between 2012 and 2015, the government ran a national empty homes programme, providing grant funding to councils and housing associations specifically to bring empty properties back into use. Tens of thousands of homes were returned to use during that period, but that programme ended in 2016. And since then, the number of long-term empty homes has risen by more than 50%. Campaigners, including the Empty Homes Network and Action on Empty Homes, are now calling for exactly that, a new national empty homes programme with proper funding for council teams, faster legal routes like EDMOs, and a serious look at why probate properties so often sit empty for years after the owner's death. There's also a growing conversation about council-owned empty properties specifically. New research published in 2025 found the number of vacant local authority-owned properties has actually increased since 2021, up significantly across England, Wales and Scotland. That's land and buildings the public sector already owns, sitting unused, while the same public sector struggles to house people. Some councils are trying creative approaches. Meanwhile, use schemes that let community groups or charities use empty buildings temporarily, partnerships with housing associations to lease and renovate long-term empty private homes, and empty homes loans, low-interest funding for owners who want to renovate a property but can't afford the upfront cost, repaid once the property is sold or let. The honest truth, though, is that none of these solutions are quick. Probate can take years to resolve through no fault of the council at all. Renovation costs on a genuinely derelict property can run into six figures, and persuading an owner, especially an absent one, to act when there's currently very little forcing them to remains the hardest problem of all. So, back to our question. Is 2,000 empty homes in area and over 1 million across England a scandal? I think the honest answer is, it depends on what you mean by scandal. If you're picturing rows of mansions deliberately left empty by absentee billionaires, that's part of the picture. But only a part, and probably the smaller part. The bigger, less dramatic truth is that this is a slow-motion failure of systems. A probate system that takes too long, a council tax incentive that's too weak for the people it needs to deter, an empty homes programme that was scrapped just as the problem started getting worse, and council teams left to manage thousands of cases with a fraction of the resources they'd need. Every one of those 2,000 properties was, at some point, somebody's home. With the right combination of funding, legal reform, and political will, every one of them could be again. The question isn't really whether the houses exist. It's whether, as a country, we're willing to do the unglamorous, paperwork-heavy, occasionally expensive work of bringing them back. If you want to see how your own council compares, how many empty homes are sitting in your area right now, the data is public, and we've put a link to the Council Taxbase Explorer in the description. If you found this useful, subscribe for more deep dives into the property stories that actually affect where and how we live. And let us know in the comments, is there a house like this on your street?